The day I became the city council's worst nightmare was the same day they thought they'd crushed me with a $50,000 fine. If you're hiding in your car right now, avoiding another pointless meeting with some bureaucrat who thinks their rubber stamp is more powerful than your rights, stick around. This story might just be the inspiration you need. Drop a comment below telling me where you're watching from. I guarantee by the end you'll be looking at your local government in a whole new light. My name is Alex Mercer, and until 6 months ago, I was what most people would consider a model citizen. I paid my taxes early, attended city council meetings, and even volunteered for the annual downtown cleanup. I'd spent 15 years building my construction company from a one-man operation into a respected local business with 38 employees. We specialized in renovating historic properties, preserving the character of our city while bringing buildings up to modern standards. I was living the American dream until I found myself in the crosshairs of a city inspector with something to prove and a council desperate for revenue. The trouble began with a building I'd purchased on Maple Street. It was a beautiful old Victorian commercial property built in 1890 that had housed everything from a hardware store to a jazz club over the decades. The place had been vacant for almost 8 years when I bought it, the price reflecting both its deteriorated condition and its potential. I had big plans: restore the facade to its original glory, convert the top floors into affordable apartments, and open a community workshop space on the ground floor where local craftspeople could share their skills. The purchase had barely gone through when City Inspector Russell Hargrove showed up unannounced. I was reviewing plans with my foreman when this guy struts in like he owns the place, clipboard in hand, not even bothering to put on a hard hat in an active construction zone. "Mr. Mercer?" he said, glancing around with obvious disdain. "I'm here for the preliminary inspection." I extended my hand, which he ignored completely. "I wasn't aware we had an inspection scheduled today," I said, keeping my tone friendly despite his rudeness. "We just closed on the property last week." Hargrove consulted his clipboard with exaggerated importance. All acquired properties in the historic district require inspection within 10 business days of transfer. It's Regulation 47B in the city code. This was news to me. I'd renovated 6 other buildings in the historic district over the years and had never heard of this particular regulation. But I'd learned long ago that with city officials, it was better to play along than push back. "No problem," I said. "Let me show you what we're planning to do with the place." As I led him through the building, explaining our restoration plans and the steps we'd take to preserve historical elements while making the space functional for modern use, I noticed something that should have set off alarm bells. Hargrove wasn't taking notes. He wasn't asking the typical questions. Instead, he was taking photos with his phone, focusing on areas that were obviously in disrepair. The very issues we were planning to fix. "The plaster damage on the ceiling, that's first on our repair list," I explained as he snapped yet another picture of the water stains. "We've already contracted with Williams Restoration. They specialize in historic plasterwork." Hargrove barely acknowledged me. "And these electrical systems?" he asked, pointing to an outdated fuse box. "Complete overhaul," I replied. "We're working with the Historical Society to update everything while maintaining period-appropriate fixtures." He made a non-committal sound and moved on. By the end of the 20-minute walkthrough, an uneasy feeling had settled in my stomach. Hargrove hadn't seemed interested in my plans or the permits I'd already secured. He'd barely looked at the architectural drawings. Instead, he'd methodically documented every flaw, every crack, every peeling bit of paint, all the reasons I'd gotten the building at below market value in the first place. "I'll be filing my report with the city planning department," he said as he headed for the door. "You'll be hearing from us." My foreman, Jake, watched him leave and let out a low whistle. "What crawled up his tailpipe and died?" I shook my head. "No idea, but something doesn't feel right. Call Diane at the permit office and see if she knows anything about this guy." 3 days later, I received an official letter from the city of Millfield. The envelope was thin, but what it contained would change the course of my life. Inside was a notice of violation listing 37 alleged code infractions, from improper rainwater drainage to unsafe historic features. The bottom line, printed in bold, was a punch to the gut. $50,000 in fines, due within 30 days, or a lien would be placed on the property. $50,000 for violations on a building I'd owned for less than 2 weeks, before we'd even begun proper renovations. I immediately called the number listed on the notice and was connected to a bored-sounding clerk who informed me that appeals could be filed in person at City Hall, but the next available hearing was in 6 weeks, well after the payment deadline. When I asked to speak with someone in authority, I was transferred to a voicemail that promised a response within 5 to 7 business days. That night, I couldn't sleep. $50,000 wouldn't bankrupt me, but it would certainly derail the renovation budget. More importantly, the principle of the thing ate at me. I'd always played by the rules, pulled all the right permits, paid my fees on time. Why was I being targeted? And why now? The next morning, I called my attorney, Sarah Martinez. Sarah had helped me navigate business law for years, but she specialized in real estate and municipal regulations. If anyone could make sense of this, she could. "This is ridiculous," Sarah said after reviewing the violation notice. "Half of these aren't even code violations for a building in pre-renovation status. They're citing you for issues that your permits already acknowledge you're going to fix." "So what do we do?" I asked. "First, we file a formal appeal. Then we request all documentation related to the inspection, including the inspector's credentials and any communications about your property." Sarah's tone shifted slightly. "And Alex, we should probably look into whether you've stepped on any political toes recently. This feels targeted." That comment stuck with me. Had I angered someone in power? My mind raced through recent interactions, business deals, community meetings. Nothing stood out. Until I remembered a city council meeting from 2 months ago. The topic had been a proposed luxury condo development that would demolish a block of historic buildings. I'd spoken against it, presenting evidence that the buildings could be profitably renovated instead of demolished. The developer, Victor Chambers, had glared at me throughout my presentation. And wasn't his brother-in-law on the city council? Over the next week, I dug deeper, calling contacts in the local business community, speaking with other contractors, meeting with members of the Historical Society. A pattern emerged. In the past year, 7 other small business owners had received similar violation notices with excessive fines. 3 had paid up. 2 had fought and eventually settled for smaller amounts. 1 had abandoned his project entirely, and 1 was still in litigation, her savings dwindling faster than the legal process was moving. The common thread? All had opposed city initiatives backed by Chambers Development Group or had properties that Victor Chambers had previously expressed interest in purchasing. "Classic harassment tactic," said Eleanor Pike, the president of the Historical Society, when we met for coffee. A retired judge, Eleanor didn't mince words. "They hit you with fines you can't reasonably fight, knowing the appeals process will drain your resources. By the time you're done, you're either broke or willing to sell for pennies on the dollar." "But isn't this illegal?" I asked. "It's practically extortion." Eleanor smiled sadly. "It's unethical, certainly. Illegal? That's harder to prove. They're using legitimate regulations, just applying them selectively and punitively, and they have the resources to outlast most challengers." I sat back, processing this. "So I'm supposed to just roll over, pay the fine, and hope they leave me alone?" "That's what they're counting on," she said, stirring her coffee thoughtfully. "What they're not counting on is someone with the resources and determination to fight back. Do you have both, Alex?" I thought about my 15 years of building a business, about my employees who depended on me, about my father who'd taught me that principles matter more than money. "Yes," I said firmly. "Yes, I do." "Then you might want to talk to Henry Blackwell," Eleanor said, writing a name on a napkin. "He used to work for the city treasurer's office before he retired. He knows where the bodies are buried, so to speak." Meeting Henry Blackwell changed everything. At 78, the former deputy treasurer still had a razor-sharp mind and a filing cabinet full of documents he probably shouldn't have kept. We met in his modest home on the outskirts of town, where model trains ran on elaborate tracks through nearly every room. They've been running this scheme for about 18 months, Henry explained, showing me spreadsheets comparing property assessments, fines, and subsequent sales. The pattern is clear once you know what to look for. Properties get hit with excessive fines, owners can't fight or pay, and within 6 months, Chambers Development acquires the property at 15 to 30% below market value. And the city officials, what do they get out of it? Henry's expression darkened. Campaign contributions, consulting fees to spouses or relatives, and in 3 cases, positions on the boards of Chambers subsidiaries after leaving office. Not technically illegal if they recuse themselves from votes directly involving Chambers, but certainly a conflict of interest. What about the building department, the inspectors? Russell Hargrove was hired 14 months ago. No previous experience in building inspection. His qualification? Former security chief at Chambers Tower. The pieces were falling into place. This wasn't just about my building. It was a systematic abuse of power affecting the entire community, and if someone didn't stand up to it, it would continue. I want to fight this, I told Henry. Not just my case, but the whole corrupt system. What would it take? Henry studied me carefully, perhaps assessing whether I was serious or just blowing off steam. Resources, documentation, public pressure, and something they don't expect, a countermove they can't easily block. I've got resources, I said. My business is solid, I can weather a storm, and I'm willing to spend money on principle. Henry nodded slowly. Then there's something you should know. The city's administrative offices, the ones housing the building department, code enforcement, and the treasurer's office. That building is coming up for sale. The city's selling their own offices? Why? Budget shortfalls. The plan is to sell the building and lease it back from the new owner. The listing hasn't gone public yet, but it will next week. Inside information, he added with a small smile. I still have friends in municipal accounting. A plan began forming in my mind. How much are they asking? $4 million. It's a steal, actually. Prime downtown location, 40,000 square feet, recently renovated utilities. In this market, it should go for 5, easy, but they need a quick sale to balance this year's budget. $4 million was a stretch, but not impossible. I'd have to leverage everything, my business, my personal investments, maybe even my home, but it was doable. What happens if the city's landlord decides to make changes? Like, say, raising the rent or requiring certain standards of conduct from his tenants. Henry's eyes twinkled. Now you're thinking like someone who wants to win a war, not just a battle. Over the next 3 weeks, I moved with calculated precision. First, I created an anonymous LLC registered in Delaware that couldn't be easily traced back to me. Then I secured financing through a combination of business loans, a second mortgage on my home, and liquidating most of my non-retirement investments. I also reached out to the other business owners who'd been targeted, sharing what I'd learned and proposing an alliance. Meanwhile, Sarah filed our appeal against the violations and submitted public records requests for all communications related to my property. She also helped draft a detailed complaint to the State Attorney General's office, though we held off on filing it. Timing would be crucial. The city administration building went on the market exactly when Henry said it would. My Delaware LLC, Blue Harbor Properties, submitted an offer the same day, $4.2 million, all cash, with a 20-day closing period and minimal contingencies. It was an offer designed to be irresistible to a city facing budget problems. While this was happening, I met with Councilwoman Prisha Patel, the one council member with a reputation for integrity and independence from the chamber's influence. I've suspected something fishy for months, she confirmed when I shared some of what I'd learned. But without documentation or witnesses willing to go on record, I can't get any traction with the ethics committee. What if I told you I might be able to get both? I asked. Would you be willing to lead the charge publicly if I provide the ammunition? Councilwoman Patel considered this carefully. If the evidence is solid, yes, political suicide isn't on my agenda, but ethical governance is. Bring me something concrete, and I'll run with it. The next step was media. Through Eleanor, I was introduced to Mia Rodriguez, an investigative reporter for the local independent newspaper. Unlike the city's main paper, which Chambers partly owned, the Millfield Independent wasn't afraid to ruffle establishment feathers. I've been trying to crack this story for months, Mia told me when we met in a coffee shop 3 towns over. But people are afraid to talk. Chambers has sued for defamation before, and not many small business owners can afford to fight that kind of legal battle. What if I gave you documented evidence and introduced you to multiple sources willing to go on record? I asked. And what if I personally indemnified them against legal costs if Chambers sues? Mia's eyebrows shot up. You'd do that? Why? Because this is bigger than me or my building. This is about whether our city is for sale to the highest bidder or whether it still belongs to the people who live and work here. 2 days later, I received notification that my offer on the city administration building had been accepted. The council had voted in a closed session, seeing only that Blue Harbor Properties was offering a quick, clean sale above asking price. Victor Chambers had reportedly submitted a competing offer, but his included contingencies and a longer closing timeline. In their eagerness to solve their budget crisis, the council had inadvertently chosen their adversary over their ally. I told no one except Sarah, who handled the closing documentation. For the plan to work, absolute secrecy was essential. The closing was scheduled for June 15th, just 3 days before my appeal hearing for the building violations. Meanwhile, our coalition grew. Through Henry's connections and my own networking, we identified and contacted 15 business owners who had been targeted over the past 18 months. 12 agreed to join our effort, sharing documentation, recording their experiences, and agreeing to go public with Mia's investigative piece, which was scheduled to run the day after my appeal hearing. On June 15th, I stood in Sarah's office as she handed me the deed to the city administration building. It was official. I now owned the very building where the people trying to find me $50,000 came to work every day. Congratulations, you're now the city's landlord, Sarah said with a mixture of amusement and concern. Are you sure about the next steps? There's still time to take a more conventional approach. I thought about all the people who'd been bullied by this corrupt system, people who didn't have the resources I had to fight back. I'm sure. Sometimes conventional approaches just maintain the status quo. On the morning of June 18th, I arrived at City Hall for my appeal hearing, dressed in my best suit. I carried a leather portfolio containing very specific documents. The hearing was scheduled for 10 a.m. in a small conference room on the 3rd floor. As expected, Inspector Hargrove was already there, along with the 3-member appeals board, all of whom, my research had shown, had connections to Victor Chambers. Mr. Mercer, the board chairwoman, Elaine Winters, greeted me with obvious disinterest. You're appealing violations number 47632 through 476669, issued on April 12th for the property at 142 Maple Street. Is that correct? That's correct, Ms. Winters, I replied calmly. And you understand that the burden of proof in this appeal rests with you as the property owner? You must demonstrate why these violations were incorrectly issued. I understand completely. Hargrove smirked slightly. He thought this was going to be easy. Before we begin, I said, I'd like to address a procedural issue. City Code requires that all inspectors be certified by the National Association of Building Officials and have at least 5 years of experience in construction or related fields. I'd like to confirm Inspector Hargrove's qualifications for the record. The smirk vanished from Hargrove's face. Chairwoman Winters frowned. Mr. Mercer, the inspector's qualifications aren't relevant to whether violations exist on your property. Actually, they are, I countered. If the inspection was conducted by someone without proper certification, it would invalidate the entire process. City Code Section 23.7 is quite clear on this point. I pulled out a copy of the City Code and slid it across the table, open to the highlighted section. I've also submitted a public records request for Inspector Hargrove's certification and employment history, which should be addressed before we proceed. The room temperature seemed to drop several degrees. Hargrove shifted uncomfortably in his seat. We'll take that under advisement, Winters said stiffly. Now, regarding the specific violations, there's one other preliminary matter, I interrupted, opening my portfolio again. I'd like to introduce into the record the ownership deed for the building at 1200 Municipal Drive. Confusion crossed the board members' faces. Mr. Mercer, that's not relevant to this proceeding, Winters said. That's the city administration building. Yes, it is, I agreed. And as of June 15th, I am the owner of that building, or more specifically, Blue Harbor Properties LLC, of which I am the sole managing member, now owns the building where all of you office. The reaction was everything I'd hoped for. Hargrove's mouth actually fell open. One board member knocked over his water glass. Winters froze, her pen suspended in midair. I've taken the liberty of drafting a new lease agreement for the city, I continued, pulling out another document and placing it on the table. You'll notice that it includes specific ethical conduct clauses for all departments operating within the building. Section 3 is particularly relevant. It prohibits the selective or punitive application of city codes for personal or political purposes. This is highly irregular, sputtered board member Davis, finally finding his voice. You can't just what? Purchase a building that was publicly for sale? I assure you, everything was done legally. I have the deed and transfer tax receipts right here. I tapped the folder. Now, about those violations on my Maple Street property. Winters looked to the city attorney, who had been silent until now. Gerald, can he? The attorney looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. Technically, yes. The city is now a tenant of Mr. Mercer's company, but that doesn't mean he can dictate city operations. Actually, I said pleasantly, as the landlord, I can establish reasonable conditions for the use of my property. If the city finds these terms unacceptable, you're welcome to relocate all municipal offices within the 60-day notice period specified in Section 7. I let that sink in. The logistics and cost of relocating every city department on short notice would be astronomical and politically disastrous for everyone in that room. But I'm reasonable, I continued. All I'm asking is that the city follow its own laws and apply them fairly to everyone, starting with a review of these alleged violations against my property, which were issued before I'd even begun the permitted renovation work. The tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife. Finally, Winters signaled for a recess. We need to consult with senior administration officials. This hearing will reconvene at 2 p.m. As they filed out, I added one more thing. Oh, and you might want to pick up a copy of tomorrow's Millfield Independent. I believe there's going to be a rather detailed story about selective code enforcement in our fair city. I've invited several of your colleagues from the mayor's office and city council to meet me for comment at 3 p.m. today. I'd be happy to include your perspectives as well. The afternoon meeting never happened. Instead, at 1:30 p.m., I received a call from the mayor's office requesting a private meeting. By 4 p.m., we had reached an agreement. All violations against my property would be dismissed as prematurely issued, and the city would undertake a comprehensive review of all building code enforcement actions over the past 2 years, to be overseen by an independent committee that included Councilwoman Patel. In exchange, I agreed to offer the city a fair market lease with reasonable terms, and I would defer any public comments until the review was complete. The next day, Mia's exposé ran anyway. I hadn't agreed to stop that, with quotes from multiple business owners describing their experiences with selective enforcement. The story didn't mention my purchase of the city building. That particular bombshell was saved for the following week, after an anonymous tip from Henry, naturally, led to a follow-up story titled, Local Developer Turns Tables on City Hall, Becomes Municipal Landlord. The public reaction was immediate and overwhelming. City Hall was flooded with calls from outraged citizens. An emergency council meeting had to be moved to the high school auditorium to accommodate all the people who showed up to speak. Victor Chambers was conspicuously absent. Within a month, Inspector Hargrove had resigned. 2 months later, following the independent review, the building commissioner and city manager were also gone. By the end of the year, 3 council members had announced they wouldn't seek re-election, and Victor Chambers had mysteriously lost interest in development projects within city limits. As for my Maple Street building, the renovation proceeded without further interference. We restored the Victorian facade to its original glory, created 12 affordable apartments for local artists, and opened the ground floor as a community workshop space called the People's Project, where residents can learn everything from woodworking to digital design. I still own the city administration building, though I've transferred it to a transparent community trust that ensures it can never be used as a weapon against citizens again. The lease agreement still includes ethical conduct clauses, which the new city administration has embraced rather than resisted. Sometimes when I walk past City Hall now, I notice that people recognize me. Some nod respectfully, others stop to chat or share their stories. A few ask how I found the courage to take such a dramatic stand. I tell them the truth. It wasn't courage as much as an unwillingness to accept injustice when I had the means to fight it. I was lucky to have resources that many don't have: money, connections, knowledge of the system. The real victory wasn't buying a building or beating a fine. It was using those privileges to level the playing field for everyone. Last week, I ran into Eleanor Pike at the coffee shop where we first discussed fighting back against the corruption. "You know," she said, stirring her coffee thoughtfully, "most people with means and power use it to get more means and more power. You used yours to give other people a voice." I shrugged, a bit uncomfortable with the praise. "I just didn't like bullies. Never have." "Well," she replied with a smile, "sometimes the best way to stop a bully isn't to become a bigger bully. It's to change the rules of the game entirely." And that's exactly what we did. The city tried to fine me $50,000, thinking I'd either pay up or give up. Instead, I bought the building they work in and reminded them who they really work for: the citizens. If you're facing your own battle against an unjust system, remember this: they're counting on your silence. They're betting you'll decide it's easier to surrender than to fight. And for most people, most of the time, that calculation is correct. Fighting City Hall isn't easy, but sometimes, just sometimes, when you find the right leverage and the right allies, you can change more than just your own situation. You can change the system itself. So if you're watching this while hiding from your own version of Inspector Hargrove or Chairwoman Winters, ask yourself, what unexpected move could turn the tables? What rules of the game can you change? And most importantly, who else might benefit if you refuse to back down? Because sometimes the most powerful weapon against corruption isn't a bigger bank account or better connections. It's the simple, stubborn unwillingness to be bullied into submission, and the creativity to find a path to justice that your opponents never saw coming.